Yes, good morning and a very warm welcome back. Um, Currently, I'm focusing a bit on very strong current topics. And of course, it's a current topic when we talk about geopolitics. What's currently happening around the axis regarding the USA, regarding the Middle East, regarding Gaza. And today we're facing a very special historical question, which, if true, would have incredible geopolitical consequences. It's about the question of whether the temple that stands in this country, which begins with the letter I, located in its capital city, is actually the Temple of Solomon, the one that is so well known in history. Is it actually in reality a temple that was dedicated to Hercules? Or is it something else entirely? Or of a god named Melkart? If that's true, then geopolitically speaking, that means very, very much and would make much of what's happening obsolete. That's a bold and interesting statement, definitely. And we're going to look into that now. What does King Solomon's temple have to do with the temple of Hercules? Are there connections that can open our eyes and bring light into the darkness? Stay tuned. It's going to be really exciting, very historical. And once again, of course, it also has something to do with our European tribes and peoples. See you soon. In the answer, I'll just say, oh yes, my dear friends. It has even more to do with Melkart and with Hercules than some entities might like. So let's now pursue this historically and politically valuable question and see together where it will lead us. And for that, we're going to take a very small trip. Where to? To the Spanish Atlantic coast, to Gadara, today's Cadiz. What does this city have to do with King Solomon? The city of Cadiz is considered the oldest city in Europe. Coincidence? I thought so. Okay. Whether that's really the case, I can't answer for you. Anything is possible. But off the coast of this wonderful city lies a small island that bears the name Sancti Petri. And what makes the island so valuable? A temple stands there. There stand the ruins of a temple that raises truly essential questions. and we have to face them. Cadiz, alias Gadara, according to the historian Strabo, who lived from 63 BC to 24 AD, Cadiz is said to have been founded by the Phoenicians, that is, the Tyrians. The Tyrians, right? What's the name of the creator god of the Germanic peoples? Tyr, right? Yes, another coincidence, of course. The Phoenicians, for example, worshipped a god by the name of Melkart. And the Greeks, as evidenced by ancient writers, turned him into Hercules. So Hercules is actually even much older. Yes? On official platforms, you can find information that there's an 18th century castle located there. But that's not quite correct, because there was actually a sanctuary there, a sacred temple of the god Melkart, this is attested, who is called Hercules today. The famous pillars of Hercules of this temple even found their way into the Spanish national flag. If you include this symbol in the country's coat of arms, I think it could well be that it was of great importance. The whole thing is intricately entwined and displayed on the national flag of Spain by the famous Habsburg motto, which is known as plus ultra. In addition to this, Hercules himself is also depicted on the official flag of the region of Andalusia, further emphasizing the historical significance. Very exciting. And today's archaeologists are even certain that this temple already stood there at the time of Troy around 1200 BC. It was there. I made a separate post about Troy last week. Please be sure to watch it. Incredibly exciting. And later this temple was repurposed by the Romans. Yes, quite clear, right? And then they were attributed to Hercules. And researchers found, with the help of ground-penetrating radar, the LIDAR radar, incredible structures even on the seabed, which point to an immense temple complex. What is certain, however, is that this temple is not of Greek origin nor of Roman origin, but by the Phoenicians it was constructed and dedicated to Melkart. The problem with the Phoenicians is that until a few decades ago, nothing was known about them at all. So everything that exists today is relatively new and also to be questioned. So why is Hercules depicted in the Andalusian flag today instead of Melkart? Since he is much older and more original. Melkart was the main god of Phoenician Tyre. The Tyrians from Tyre, named after the Germanic god Tyr. But he was also worshipped in Carthage, right? So also a part of Phoenicia. It was a colony. Yes, that was also founded by the Phoenicians in North Africa. Herodotus, for example, who wrote, he lived from 490 to 430 before Christ, so long before Jesus Christ, in the 5th century before Christ, who reported that two large columns stood in front of the temple, one fashioned from gold and the other from emerald. The historian Lucian, I found out, already distinguishes between the Greek Hercules and the Tyrian Hercules. Oh, look at that, right? And the Tyrian Hercules, meaning Melkart, is said to have been much older. We find that in Lucian. Strabo, in turn, said that these columns were the pillars of Hercules. Are these the real pillars of Hercules? As I said, the word Phoenician is relatively recent. After all, until the middle of the 20th century, nothing was known of their existence at all. So, of course, there are many theories, but there is nothing really substantial about the Phoenicians. But I have my own theories about that, and I've already explained them to you in my books, and we find a part of it again today, of course. In any case, two columns stood in front of this temple, and there are reconstructions of the appearance of this temple. And it will open everyone's eyes right away, without hesitation, and raise very big questions. Because of the reconstruction of this temple, who or what does it really remind you of, if anything? Go online and search on the internet for various images of King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, perhaps from different sources, to get a better idea. You're going to be amazed. Both temples don't just look similar, they are virtually 100% identical. And when I saw that, I thought to myself, this is hard to believe. These synchronicities can no longer be a coincidence. What's behind it, and how can we explain it to ourselves? There were also two flanking pillars there, just like there. The construction was exactly the same, the proportions exactly the same, the courtyard exactly the same. Yes, in a biblical context, these two flanking pillars are actually called, or in a religious context, in Israel, Jachin and Boaz. Yes, so they are apparently actually the pillars of Melkart, later called the pillars of Hercules. And for the Phoenicians, these were those two famous pillars, which other peoples moved to Gibraltar because they assumed that after the Strait of Gibraltar between Spain and Africa, the named or then known world had come to an end. The Phoenicians knew that. The Phoenicians were also capable of deep sea navigation. Yes, I mean, Cadiz is on the Atlantic coast, not inside the Mediterranean. They also had Tyre, which was in the Mediterranean on the far right. They had Carthage in the Mediterranean, well, not in the middle, on the African north. So they could pass the Strait of Gibraltar very easily and long before that. For them, the world didn't end there. The Phoenicians knew it, the Celts knew it too, because they worked very closely together. And they were a people, again, who were the only ones, along with the Celts, to perfectly master deep sea navigation. That explains a lot. Is the temple in Sancti Petri of Cadiz, the former Gadara, actually the true temple of Solomon? Did everything happen here? The whole story about Solomon in reality? And are we actually telling the story of the Spanish King Solomon now in Israel? Was it relocated to a new setting? I mean, we know this, it's normal. We have the story of Odysseus, which was relocated. The then head of the Library of Alexandria already spoke about that. Nautical experts can trace this based on the stories of Odysseus, that it didn't take place in the Mediterranean. Homer's stories have all been localized, and that's how it was done. Partly because cultures bring their stories with them to new places that they conquer or settle, and tell them there, or even retell them. At least that's how it seems, right? The suspicion is steadily growing that in reality, what we are actually being told is, in fact, a borrowed or secondhand story that originally comes from Spain, which really has absolutely nothing to do with its alleged origin. And that is already a geopolitical bombshell, a Pandora's box for certain circles. We know that the stories, as mentioned, of Homer and Odysseus probably even took place in the Atlantic, the North, and the Baltic Seas. The stories were brought by the northern peoples around 1200 BC, exactly the time when the Phoenicians also lived, to Greece. The time in which Solomon also lived later. And they were simply localized. And that, as I said, I'll repeat it again, was already known by the then head of the Library of Alexandria, who clearly wrote it down. People have always liked to deck themselves out in borrowed plumes, and that is not the only clue we have. Look, the Phoenicians or the Canaanites in the northeast, on the right side of the Mediterranean, yes, they report of an even much older and further temple of Hercules in Tyre itself. So, and according to ancient traditions, this is said to have stood there more than 2,300 years before. 2,300 years before, which would mean the date of construction would even have to be placed in the 3rd millennium BC. We have information that there must have been several more such temples. Yes, but that also makes sense. For example, the one in Sancti Petri, in Granada, probably also one in Tyre, of course, even one on the North Sea coast, and many more. Perhaps we should not leave unmentioned, and it is important to note that the names in Palestine, in Philistine, which was founded by the Philistines, names like Acre, Sidon, Tyre, Gaza, are actually of ancient Nordic origin. That is even considered certain that they are Germanic, Indo-Germanic terms in the Bible itself. Carthage or Phoenicia is also referred to as Tyre. We find that, for example, in the Bible in 2 Samuel 5:11 and 1 Kings 9:11, there we find the entry that Hiram, the king of Tyre, traded with King Solomon and had a large part of his temple built by Hiram. So the Phoenicians built it for him. What we are told today about the Phoenicians honestly seems unlikely to me, and perhaps even serves as a kind of diversionary tactic, something meant to keep us from wanting or even being able to truly fathom the truth. especially when it comes to matters of a religious nature or narrative. They want to tell us, or at least suggest, that the Phoenicians probably came from the Black Sea area, the Phoenicians. They want to tell us that their script is based on the Greek and Hebrew alphabets, but that is not correct, my dear friends. That is not correct. And that's why in my book about King Solomon, we follow this trail very closely. And we have the clues, we have the evidence, where the script comes from, where it really came from, and they reveal a completely new picture, a completely different picture than one might think. It is even official that the pillars Jachin and Boaz were imitations, which were created by an artist from Kurum, a Tyrian artist, so again a Phoenician, and that similar pillars stood at the entrance of the famous Temple of Melkart in the city of Tyre. And the pillars stood for the opposites, the divine, but also the earthly human being. They stood for the active, but also the passive expression of divine energy. So if you enter the house through the door, yes, duality, polarity. Between the pillars, you enter something androgynous, male, female, center, because God is both male and female. That is the message. But it also represents the summer and winter solstices. And to pass through, to walk through these pillars, that meant a very symbolic transformation and initiation. That is the actual true reason. But let's now consider the fact that these pillars existed long before Solomon's time, as did their meaning. That is important to know. Long before a certain religion that has appropriated them, ultimately, a people seeking a new identity adopted and copied teachings from other cultures, and nothing else happened in order to give themselves a new identity. So everything is actually much older and much deeper than is conveyed and assumed. And all these teachings, they have a much older core and also a much older origin than many are able to think. And this becomes particularly clear to us when we realize that today's teaching of Judaism comes from Canaan, from Phoenicia. Wow, it was a religious breakaway movement. And the main god of the Canaanites was El. I've made my own YouTube posts about that, very detailed. El had a wife named Asherah, and both had sons, one named Baal and one named Yahweh. Baal was the kind one, similar to our Balder of the Celts, the luminous one, yes, the Baal fire, the light that is still celebrated in northern Europe today. Yahweh, however, became known as a god of storm and war. And by the choice of a certain people to choose Yahweh instead of Baal as their main god, an intention becomes recognizable here too, doesn't it? Why was he specifically chosen? Now, one only had to obscure the true background of who Yahweh was and is. So, this happened through the violent written biblical destruction and defamation of Baal and Asherah. We see this very clearly in the Old Testament. El, the topic of Elohim, which is a plural anyway and not a singular, Eloha is the singular. El was simply replaced with Yahweh, which cannot be, but it was done and it is not consistent. Likewise, a new dogma was created, and all peoples who knew the truth were fought to the death. So Asherah and Baal were fought so that only Yahweh remained. Yes, with Asherah, femininity was destroyed, yes, which was at the side of El, in order to establish a male society. Now, quite honestly, no one 3,000 years ago would have suspected that we would find this out today. That the internet exists, that writings are translated. Thanks to archaeology, thanks to history, etymology, genealogy, genetics, and ultimately also, as I said, the internet, truths are finally being revealed to us that remained hidden for millennia. You just have to connect the dots. It is incredible what is currently coming to light. All half-truths and untruths will now be recognized, which is like an energetic apocalypse, a true revelation. And I think what is happening right now is gigantic. Now, this knowledge just needs to reach humanity. That is all. Let's ask ourselves a question. Look, how would the Phoenicians have acquired perfect knowledge of deep sea navigation if they actually came from the Black Sea region? Or that of the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf? It's not possible. They must have received their knowledge from a people who are very well versed in ocean navigation. And that is exactly how it was, because they were descended from the Nordic peoples of Europe. And that too is to be nipped in the bud again. Baltic Sea, North Sea, Atlantic, they came to the Levant several thousand years before Christ. This has even been confirmed in the Israel Times, and they settled there already in the Bronze Age. Their capital was Tyre. Tyre. That is in present-day Lebanon. Well, the famous excavation site of Baalbek is also in Lebanon, right? The topic of Baal. And who else is said to have been born in Tyre? It is becoming clearer and clearer. The goddess Europa. I found that very interesting. Europa is said to have been the daughter of the Phoenician king Agenor. Zeus was in love with her, and and is said to have married her before he met Hera. And among their children, their common children, is the famous Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon. We know Minos relatively well. The oldest literary reference for this is, unfortunately, Homer with his Iliad. Exactly that Homer, of whom it is reported that he moved the legends of Odysseus from the North and Baltic seas to the Mediterranean region. Did he do that with the legend of Troy as well? I made my contribution about that last week. Was this story also at least distorted? Probably. In honor of Europa, even a continent was named after her. But where is it located? Not over there. I think there was a reason for choosing the continent that was used for it, and the Phoenicians were extremely closely linked with Europa. As I said, the western coast of Spain was Phoenician Celtic. I also report on this very extensively in my book Isaac and Rebecca, and partly in the Book of Solomon. The Phoenicians were with Europa very, 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 very closely linked, so that we must ask the question whether Europa was named so, because it represents clues to the origin of the work, the true work. It is their ancestral home. And even today, the goddess Europa is depicted on the €5 and €10 banknotes, my dear friends. The chain of evidence is actually incredibly large. Let's ask ourselves again, as I said, what was the name of the creator god of the Germanic peoples? Oh, that was Tyr. And Tyr was later replaced in Europe by Odin. But Tyr was first. But he was probably worshipped much longer by emigrants in the Mediterranean region. It can therefore be assumed that the Norse god Tyr played a very central role in the naming of Tyre. Tyr is connected by many with Zeus. But Tyr is also called Ziu. Look it up yourself on Wikipedia. You can read all about it. Tyre, he is also called Ziu. Ziu is interesting anyway. What was the name of the figure of Noah again? In the story of the same name about the Great Flood in the Sumerian cuneiform scripts? Oh, Ziusudra. Ziusudra Noah was named after the Germanic creator god Tyr. So the parallels we see here, I find them gigantic when we connect the dots that allow us to glimpse a completely new view of history. The main deity in Tyre was Baal Hammon. Yes, okay, the name Baal, we've already explained that. He was fought against in the most terrible way in the texts of the Old Testament and portrayed as evil. But Baal translated means nothing other than Lord. That's it. Under Amenhotep II. In Egypt, they even worshipped a sanctuary of Baal with the epithet Saphon. So Baal Saphon, Lord of the North. We also find Baal Saphon in the Bible. Of the North? Okay. Oh yes, you heard correctly. Tyr comes from the high north, Baal too. And Balder also came from the high north. Maybe you're familiar with this Jesus of the Celts. He was also called Balder, Baalder, the Shining One, who is also depicted with a halo with a crown of rays. He was the son of Odin and Frigga. He is considered the most peaceful and purest of all Aesir gods. Known for his mercy, but also for his wisdom. That was a true figure of light, and that was disparaged by other faiths. It had to be disparaged, of course, clearly, to push through their own interests. The term Baal thus became a synonym for evil par excellence. He was accused of burning children as sacrifices, as we read in Jeremiah 19:5. The Romans accused the Carthaginians, that is, the Phoenicians, similar to the First World War when the same was said about the Germans, that they ate children in Belgium. But all that was bad propaganda as we know today. They desperately wanted to enforce and firmly establish the worship of Yahweh, their God, by absolutely any means necessary. The problem, however, was just this. Baal, the Canaanite deity, had been worshipped in the region of northern Israel for many centuries, long before their efforts began. See, first, King 1632, the title Baal was even used for Yahweh himself in early times. Oh, look at that. They were brothers after all, and that connection was significant. Even the biblical Saul, who is a well-known figure in ancient history, named one of his sons. Now, this is where it gets really exciting and interesting. Yes, the famous biblical Saul named one of his sons Ishbaal. Ishbaal, the man of Baal. Okay? He named another son Beliada. Baal has known. But at some point it escalated in First Kings 16:31 to 32, because there, as it is written, we read that King Ahab of Israel married a princess from Tyre. O god Aphron, and in her honor erected a temple of Baal in Samaria. Well, King Jehu, the people of Israel had all the prophets and priests of Baal in the land put to death. He tore down the temples of Baal in Jerusalem, which is in 2 Kings 10:18 to 27. The worship of Baal, it becomes completely incompatible with the faith of Israel. And so the name Baal was quite naturally, you see, well, it was eventually given the meaning of an idol, or in other words, something that people would worship as a false god. Let's put it that way. As I said, Baal actually just means Lord when translated. And so you could slap the name Baal on any god that didn't suit you in Israel and nip any discourse in the bud. Good propaganda. Above all, they do not shy away from the terrible crimes of destroying those of other faiths. That's genocide, what happened there. For example, I'll specifically quote, or rather cite a passage from Numbers, chapter 25, verses 3 to 5. I quote, "And Israel joined himself unto Baal-peor, so one of the Baals. They called them all Baal, simply to defame them. This one was probably called Peor. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said to Moses, Take all the heads of the people and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, Slay everyone his men that were joined unto Baal-peor." End of quote. That's an incitement to mass murder, isn't it? And nothing else. To ethnic cleansing. Moses never did that. Please read my book, Moses, Way of Truth, about this. These are things for which his name was misused. Sad but true. Deuteronomy 4:3. Your eyes have seen what the Lord did because of Baal-peor. For all the men that followed Baal-peor, the Lord thy God hath destroyed them from among you. End of quote. 2 Kings 11, 17, 18. And all the people of the land went into the house of Baal and break down his altars. His altars they break, and break his images thoroughly. And Matan, the priest of Baal, they slew before the altars. And the priest appointed officers over the house of the Lord. Well, that's how it's done, right? In the story of Balder, for example, it is said that he returns after Ragnarok, that is the apocalypse, the rapture, the twilight of the gods, and builds a new world structure. He was then supposed to usher in the new golden age with his brilliance. Do you also know this story from later religions? This one here is older. Everything copied again, simply plagiarized in the search for identity. And exactly this Balder was then mocked and fought most bitterly in Israel by a god of the Old Testament, who is full of vengefulness, jealousy, and bloodlust. Among the Canaanites and the Phoenicians, Baal was actually also considered a protector. Protector of maritime trade, of ships, which is why many sanctuaries were built for him along the coast. Yes, and those were naturally meant to be destroyed then. In old records, we find a travel report, for example, by King Sargon I, who traveled from Mesopotamia to the North Sea, likely Heligoland according to the description, to King Gon. And after his return, he reported that he had stayed in the land of the old gods and their actual origin, where they will one day find their way back. Did people really still know their true origin in such old writings, I ask? We are finding more and more evidence and clues and proof. So let's establish this now. The Phoenicians were formerly a Nordic people who settled in the Mediterranean. As I said more on that in my book about King Solomon, Moses, but also Isaac and Rebekah, there you will recognize all the connections. They worshipped Baal, or rather Baldur as well, and named their capital after the former Germanic creator god Tyr. The names of their cities are all etymologically clearly Indo-Germanic and of Nordic origin. There is no doubt about that. The Pentapolis, they were closely connected with the Celts of their time, especially in northern Spain, also in Cadiz, and they worked together. They engaged in trade and even later went to war together against the Romans. The Celts even fought on Hannibal's side, just by the way, in the Punic Wars. Who was Hannibal? Phoenician Carthage. The Phoenicians even managed, together with the Celts, to find a passage to South America and sailed up the Amazon, all the way to Peru. Today's evidence can be found in the Peruvian highlands with the Chachapoyas, who genetically today are clearly of Irish, Nordic, Scottish origin. Red-haired, freckled, and pale in Peru. Clearly. Genetically proven. In a letter from the king of Ugarit to the Egyptian pharaoh during the 14th century before Christ, the king equated a god named Baal Zephon with the Egyptian god Amun, establishing a notable connection between these two deities. Oh yes, that is quite interesting. And even on the German border with Rome, a sanctuary of Baal-zephon was mentioned as early as the 3rd century BC. I don't want to start an argument here, my dear friends. Whether the god Baal really comes from the far north or from Egypt, in the end, both are correct. Because ultimately Egypt was co-founded by the Atlantean high priest Thoth. Thoth is said to have come to Egypt via the northern route through Germany, while the Egyptian god Osiris came via the southern route of the Canaries. The connection between ancient Germanic customs, Nordic customs in Egypt is incredible. I have already written very, very much about that. The Phoenicians, they were really in very close connection with King Solomon. Was this connection actually even closer than some suspect? Were they perhaps even related? The theory we explore in my book is whether King Solomon was actually a Celt or a Phoenician or a mixture of both, and who his father King David was. There are actually no historical records for the Temple of King Solomon in that one country with that one capital. There are none. No extra biblical evidence. In Spain, we find an infinite number of them. So that much revolves around the Greek, formerly Phoenician Melkart in Spain, or must have taken place there. Well, all the very old legends show us that. They want to tell us that Melkart had Semitic roots. Oh my God, they're infiltrating everything, I thought to myself. And that's not true, it can't be. Melkart is clearly of Phoenician origin and has nothing to do with those who are referred to as Semites today. This belief in corresponding temples existed long before them. They existed long before the development of the god Yahweh as a creator god, to which this god with 4 letters was the son of El and Asherah among the Canaanites, and thus not a creator god who created our earth. One should also say that in former times, Gaditano Hercules was considered Egyptian by that culture, by others again as Libyan or Phoenician, but not Greek in origin. And that's probably because today's Greeks only emerged around 1200 BC and writing only around 900. And I explain much, much more about that in the book. Because there are other very interesting details about the Phoenicians that we will then look at. I mean, what do you think? What kind of political and religious domino effect this would trigger now if it were officially recognized that the temple in Jerusalem wasn't even located there, or didn't have the significance that is attributed to it? If copies of much older temples exist, that served completely different purposes. What if it were acknowledged that Solomon resided in Spain and history had unfolded in a completely different way? Would that result in a completely different picture? Would that cause an entire political and religious construct and concept to collapse? Would half truths be revealed? Certain conflicts and wars would no longer have any legitimacy, and all this global madness would finally be abolished? Question mark, question mark, question mark, seriously, question mark, question mark, question mark. Wouldn't that be a true liberation from dogmatic ways of thinking? Could such insights liberate our present and future? Pacify them? Remember, we cannot create a loving and benevolent future for everyone if it is based on half truths and untruths from the past, which form a false foundation and continue to deceive us and let us run blindly into the next pit. And that can now be successfully resolved in this time as everything, really everything, if we open our minds. In this sense, I'll just say, Afata. I want to summarize it for you once more at the end, just very briefly. A. It is official that the pillars, Jachin and Boaz, are imitations. They were imitations created by Hiram, the Tyrian artist. And that similar pillars were at the entrance of all famous temples, which were called the Temple of Melkart and later the Temple of Hercules, and also stood entire. Wow, that alone is already a brilliant fact. Secondly, the Temple of Melkart of the Phoenicians was the model for the image of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, one-to-one identical. Thirdly, the Temple of Melkart already stood in Tyre 2,300 years before Herodotus, so 2,700 before Christ. Fourthly, the Phoenician city names, Philistine city names. I've made my own posts about who the Philistines were, also revealed in the Book of Moses. Like Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Tyre are Indo-Germanic, they are of Nordic origin. Fifthly, the god Tyr was a creator god of whom? The Germanic peoples. Point 6. The Phoenicians were an incredibly large, good seafaring people, a seafaring people that didn't exist in the Mediterranean before. They originally came from the North Sea and Atlantic region, and they brought their knowledge with them to the Mediterranean. Seventhly, the Celts and the Germanic tribes were close and good friends with the Phoenicians and Carthaginians. They traded together and even demonstrably fought side by side. Eighth, Tyr is also referred to as Zeo. Is that the template for the name Zeus? Noah is called Zeusudra in Sumerian cuneiform, all after the Germanic creator god. And to complete the set, number 9. The goddess Europa was born in Tyre, was the namesake of Europe. An allusion to the origin? Question mark. Dear ones, all the best, blessed week. And we will report more about it. Yeah? Ciao.